Hello, I'm Michelle Green. I'm a Project Director here in the Health Economic Modelling team at YHEC. In this webinar, I'm going to talk to you about the issues that you may face when estimating the costs associated with medical devices. So before we get into the issues associated with measuring the cost of devices, we need to think about why we need to accurately measure costs. So in order to ascertain the cost effectiveness of a new device, we need to be able to determine the likely costs associated with the use of the intervention, as well as the benefit. Now, this webinar will focus on the cost side. We should always consider following aspects when accurately measuring costs. Firstly, how much does the device or the intervention cost, and to whom? So the perspective that we are interested in. This might be the NHS within the UK as a whole, or it might be specific hospitals within the NHS. We want to consider if we're interested in direct or indirect costs. That's costs that fall directly on the perspective of interest, which would typically be what we were interested in, or indirect costs, which is those costs that fall outside of the perspective of interest. We also need to consider the time horizon over which we measure costs. So this might be the very short term in some interventions, for instance, a surgical procedure where all costs occur during that procedure itself, and long-term costs don't differ with the new intervention compared to standard of care. Or it might be in a much longer time horizon where there's impact on mortality and long-term costs and health outcomes. We also need to consider first order versus second order costs, though that is costs related to the disease in question and those that fall outside of the disease in question. And finally, we have various device-specific costing issues, which I'll now come on to talk about. So the first issue that I'll come on to talk about is the changes to product and component design that we see with medical devices. So medical devices regularly go incremental improvements to impact on things such as the safety of the device or the efficacy of the device. In terms of how we capture this within costing a device, we should use costs that represent the most up-to-date costs of the device, i.e. the version that's being sold and is available to the healthcare system. However, we do also need to consider implications around the generalisability of clinical data. So we may have trials that use multiple versions of a particular device, some of which are older versions, some of which are newer versions, or we may have evidence that's purely based on an older version of the device. Usually on a case-by-case basis, we'd want to consider whether we include all of that evidence or just evidence on the latest version. The second issue to consider are training costs. So medical devices often require staff training to enable them to use the device fully. So the effectiveness of the device is both impacted by the device itself and the person using the device. Often, companies developing medical devices provide training to staff free of charge in terms of the company covers the cost of that training. However, there will be the cost associated with staff time for them attending that training. Say, for instance, particular nurses go on a one-day training course, then there will be the cost of their time for attending that course. So we should always consider the cost of this time during the training period within any kind of cost analysis that we're undertaking, so we capture that cost of the training. We may also wish to include the impact of the learning curve on the efficacy of the device. So it may be that when users first use a particular device, they're not expert users and they're not able to use it to its full potential. But after a certain number of users, they become more expert in the use of the device. And we may wish to consider kind of a lower efficacy or lower effectiveness outcomes whilst the user is getting to grips with how to use that device. The next issue that I'll consider relates to indivisibility of equipment. So, unlike pharmaceuticals, which are used by kind of tablets per patient, a medical device may be used by multiple patients, sometimes for different purposes. So one might ask if MRI scans are cost effective compared to doing nothing in making a diagnosis in patients with back pain. However, an MRI scanner could be purchased for multiple purposes and for use by multiple different patients. So how do we cost up these devices that are used by many patients? And the solution to this is that we want to annuitize costs to capture the opportunity cost of purchasing the device, its lifespan and discounting. We then need to ascertain how many patients on average would use the device, and we can calculate a cost per patient based upon the cost of the device itself, how long it lasts for, the present value of the device, and how many patients will use it over its lifetime. And when doing this, we want to consider both fixed and variable costs of the device. So often with devices, there'll be a large upfront cost, and then there'll be consumables that are perhaps used on a per patient basis, and those consumables we would want to add on for each patient. The final issue that I'm going to cover relates to the replacement and depreciation of devices. So often medical devices need replacing after a certain number of uses or years. For instance, we see with implantable devices that a battery run, over time the battery will become inefficient and will need replacing. So when we undertake our cost analysis, we want to incorporate the replacement of medical devices at particular points in time in the analysis. And as these are future costs, they should be discounted appropriately. And by that I mean we should work out the net present value of those replacement devices that happen in the future. We may model time to failure of a particular device using survival analysis. So we can look at how long the device survives for, plot that on a graph, and have replacement of the likelihood of replacement of the device at any given time based upon that parametric survival analysis. So those are the key issues that I wanted to cover. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions or would like to get in touch, please don't hesitate to contact me using the contact details on the screen. Bye bye.